What are some of dark events happened in history not many people know about? In the early 80s, Bayer knowingly sold millions of dollars worth of HIV and hepatitis-tainted medications to Asia and Latin America. These countries didn't have laws to prevent the proliferation of tainted drugs. Thousands of people died as a result. It was hardly mentioned on any news platforms. Once in the 70s, a film crew was filming an episode of The $6 Million Man, and they were shooting at an amusement park funhouse kind of thing. A stagehand was moving what he thought was a prop wax figure on a noose, only for one arm to fall off, revealing human flesh and bone underneath. After an autopsy, it was revealed to be the 60-something-year-old corpse of an old Wild West outlaw that had been taxidermied to an extent. Edit, thanks for the award. A lot of Salmonella fans, huh? To be specific, it was the corpse of Elmer Kerdi, the "you'll never take me alive" guy. The ideal maternity home here in Canada. From the 1920s till the 1940s, they took in babies from unwed mothers and they were selling them especially to desperate Jewish families in New Jersey. Adoption was illegal in the US back then. It was later discovered that the people who ran this business would starve the unmarketable babies by feeding them only molasses and water. The babies would last around 2 weeks on this diet. They put the corpses in wooden boxes often used for butter, and that's why the victims are called the butter box babies. The boxes were either buried on the property or at sea or burned in the home furnace. The parents who gave their child to this maternity home would go back and see how their child is doing, but were told the child has died when in fact it had been sold to adopting parents. Between 400 and 600 died in that home and at least 1,000 were adopted, but sadly, the adopted babies often suffered from diseases because of the unsanitary conditions and lack of care at the home. The cadaver synod. Basically, the Pope had a previous Pope's corpse exhumed so the corpse could stand trial for something made up. So they dug up his bloated 7-month-old corpse and convicted him, retroactively nullifying his papacy. Then they dumped his bloated and convicted corpse in a river. The people got pissed and overthrew the Pope, who was strangled in prison. The next Pope came along and had the corpse collected from the river and its papacy posthumously reinstated. 897 was a crazy year. During Prohibition, the government funded and led an operation to release barrels of alcohol that they had poisoned to make people sick and shy away from bootleg liquor. Lots of people ended up dying, but people still drank more than ever. The Halifax explosion. Regarded by many as the biggest man-made explosion prior to the invention of the atomic bomb. A ship laden with explosives collided with another vessel in Halifax harbor. The resulting explosion flattened much of the city's downtown core, killing roughly 2,000 and injuring 9,000. The blast is said to have temporarily displaced the water in the harbor, forming a tsunami that reached up to 15 meters high, surging over the wreckage of the waterfront. The following day, Halifax was hit by a blizzard that dumped 40 centimeters of snow on top of the city, further complicating rescue efforts. The city is also home to a cemetery where many victims of the Titanic were laid to rest. It is said that the body identification system, developed at the time of the Titanic's sinking in 1912, aided efforts to identify victims of the Halifax explosion in 1917. There's a surprising amount of people that don't know about the Rwanda genocide that happened pretty recently, like when Bill Clinton was president. Basically, there were two types of Rwanda natives, the Hutus and Tutsis. The Hutus believed the Tutsis were invaders of land that was theirs, and after the assassination of the Rwandan leader, who was a Hutu, the Hutus were ordered to chop down the tall trees, which meant kill the Tutsis. The differences between Hutus and Tutsis were that Hutus were supposedly darker-skinned, shorter in stature, and had shorter faces. That's why the Tutsis were called tall trees. The events that followed killed so many Tutsis, yet the UN was stingy to call it a genocide. They never like using that term because of its association with World War II and the Nazis. It wasn't until very recently that the killings stopped. To this day, Hutus and Tutsis that survived the genocide speak at events side by side, speaking about how terrible the events were. In my family's region in Africa, they used to carry out the death penalty by snake bite. Just a snake bite to each ankle, and then letting the man spend his remaining time with his family before he died, under supervision. I thought it sounded sort of humane in a way, like our lethal injections, but apparently they say it was one of the most horrific ways that existed. The most horrific part is that your family watches this death. Letting the man spend his remaining time with his family here really means making him die a slow, agonizing death in front of his family. Man, that makes it a whole lot worse actually. The said case of Ota Benga. He was a pygmy boy from the Congo who was essentially captured and brought to the USA to be displayed in freak shows. He had undergone tribal customs such as having his teeth filed into points before his capture. He eventually got out of the carnivals and dreamed of returning to Africa. Then World War I happened, making the trip impossible for the foreseeable future. He committed suicide by gunshot. Not only was he in a freak show, but he was also put in the zoo, sharing an enclosure with apes. The VIPE Home experiment. Sweden are mostly known as a not very scary country, with good and mostly accessible dental care. Well, part of how that came to be is this. Hey, you are institutionalized and suffering and powerless, let's make your teeth rot out of your skull. 4. Science. Many younger folks may hold that view of Sweden. For us slightly older and who have done our homework, we know Sweden's closet is bursting with skeletons. Good old eugenics in it. In the 1920s, the Osage Indians, Oklahoma, USA, discovered one of the largest oil fields on Earth. They went from being poor to being the richest civilization on Earth overnight. Imagine Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Elon Musk living on the same street. The Osage were building mansions, hiring servants, driving exotic cars, and the women were marrying white men as trophy husbands. It wasn't long before people started moving into town and exploiting them. Slowly, one by one, they began being murdered. By the end, hundreds had died. The men were hiring people to kill their wives. Lawyers were drawing contracts to transfer oil rights and tricking the Osage into signing them. It was so crazy that it led to the birth of the FBI. This was one of their original investigations, and is still largely unsolved. Martin Scorsese is currently writing/directing a movie about it. It's going to be based on the book, Killers of the Flower Moon, which is where I learned about it. Super interesting read. The Radium Girls. In the 1920s, they worked at a watch company painting the hours on the watches using radium, a radioactive element that glows in the dark. They did this with no PPE and weren't told radium is dangerous. Meanwhile, the chemists had full PPE and worked in a sealed environment. Worse, they were instructed to lick the tip of the brush to make a very fine point. Some of them would paint their nails or their teeth with it for fun when they went out at night. They would develop cancer whenever the paint touched, and many of them had such decay in their jaws that their mandibles had to be held on with bandages. Edit. Apparently there's a new movie about this, as many Redditors have helpfully pointed out.